Hey, Carmen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. So, for those of you who have not met Carmen yet, Carmen Simon PhD is the author of the brand new book, Impossible to Ignore: Creating Memorable Content to Influence Decisions. She's a cognitive scientist, and she's helped some of the world's most visible brands craft memorable messages by focusing on how the brain actually works. Her sought-after keynote speeches unveil science-based techniques for getting other people to see your way, remember your way, and go your way. Carmen, it's great to have you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I look forward to our conversation.
Yeah, likewise. So tell us about your background, kind of how you got started as an author and why you wrote this book.
I wrote this book as a result of an experiment that I did 2 years ago. And in that research study, I asked a very simple question. I was curious to know if I showed an audience a PowerPoint deck of 20 slides, how many of those slides they will remember 48 hours later. And the answer of how much people remembered didn't really surprise me that much. Out of 20 slides, after 2 days, people reported remembering on average 4 slides. So that was fine. But what really hurt my feelings was the fact that out of 1,500 people who participated in the study, 500 of them, so a third of my population, wrote back 2 days later and said, "What presentation?" So imagine there was quite a large amount of people who had no recollection of looking at that stuff. And that portrays a very significant business problem because we believe that we have so much brilliance and we showcase that in a lot of communication artifacts. And surely if we say it, people must remember it. It's a given. And it's not. It's not. People forget their lives almost as quickly as they live them. And while in our personal lives that has negative consequences, in business it has dire consequences because you only live in business to the extent that your audiences remember you.
Yeah, that's amazing. So like you said, like 25% of the people just completely forget in 2 days.
Yeah, a third of the population just completely didn't remember. A few of them wrote back and they were just extremely apologetic. Like I remember one person saying, "I must have my head examined because I just really do not remember viewing this presentation." And these are mentally healthy people. These are business professionals. I didn't have any kind of special audiences participating. And what was also surprising as a result of the study was the fact that about 8% of those who didn't remember anything, they didn't report a full and pure 0. In other words, not that many people wrote back and said, "I don't really remember this." Nothing. Very few are that honest. Many of them made things up. So, in other words, they didn't really want to say they didn't remember the presentation, but when I asked them specifically what is it that they remembered, I could tell that either they gave credit to another source. So, for example, with a few of them, I had had a webinar a few weeks prior, and they were remembering things from that source versus this presentation that was part of the study. Some other people reported remembering things that were never even there. So, for example, the topic of the presentation was what to wear and not to wear, very much like we're doing right now on a virtual call, in a virtual interview where your video is being shared. And it's basic guidelines like stay away from red and black and stay away from stripes and patterns that tend to dance on the screen. Be careful about your lighting and your positioning, those kinds of guidelines. And some people reported that they remembered from this presentation the fact that you should tell stories and you should organize your message well. So those were still good guidelines, and they were still related to communication and having an interview, but they weren't something that they had learned in that presentation that was part of the study.
That's fascinating. So do you think these people who just completely forgot the information, were they just not paying attention during the presentation, or is it more than that?
I'm glad that you brought that point because attention definitely paves the way to memory. It's not impossible for us to remember things that we didn't consciously pay attention to. So that can definitely happen. But obviously in a business setup, we're not after creating any kind of subliminal messages from an ethical standpoint. So let's go for the scenario in which we say you have to pay attention to something to increase the likelihood that you will remember it. So you're absolutely right. If people don't pay attention to a stimulus that much, we're decreasing the likelihood of remembering. But obviously, attention is only one of the variables that impacts how much people remember later on. In the book, in the Impossible to Ignore book, I identified 15 variables that we can use to influence other people's memory. And I emphasize the word other because so often, whenever people think about memory, they think about how to improve it for themselves. But in business, we have to be increasingly concerned how to improve other people's memory about things that we want to communicate. So 15 variables and attention-related variables are just a few. Additional ones are obviously repetition. That's a fairly intuitive one, and emotion, the same thing. But so are distinctiveness, for instance, and even familiarity. A lot of people think that we should be standing out a lot of times, and that's how people remember. That's only one way in which we remember. But familiarity is still useful because if we have learned the most important thing about the brain is this: the brain does one thing and one thing very well, which is looking for ways to conserve energy. This is because it has to expand a lot of energy, and whenever it has a chance to conserve it, it will take it. This is why familiar things are preferable quite often, because the brain does not have to think as much. So for instance, give you an example for your case. What are some familiar things that you just totally enjoy, and you realize that the reason you enjoy them is because they don't make you think that much? What are some of your familiar
Well, like playing sports comes to mind, like playing Ultimate, like, you get in the flow and just completely don't even have to think about what you're doing. You just play.
Exactly. So the minute that you have taken the brain to a habitual place where you've engaged in that routine for so often, then you're on automatic, and that cognitive power is reduced, and that is huge because the brain enjoys to be in that spot. And unfortunately, especially in business content, we want to impress our audiences so much with novelty, constant novelty, disruption, all these things that are happening that deviate from a pattern. And it's a shame because familiarity quite often may draw attention first. And then once you have the brain's attention, you can aspire more at the novelty and things that the brain hasn't experienced before, like surprise.
Gotcha. So how do you add familiarity to a presentation? Like, how can you actually apply that?
So, for example, we're working with a company here in the Bay Area called Aptus, and they operate in the space that's called quote to cash, meaning that as you're interacting with your own customers and you want to make sure that you partner with them from the very moment that your first interaction happens to the moment that they pay you, there's a quote to cash journey. And Aptus has developed a software application and an algorithm that makes that journey a lot smoother and a lot faster. And what they did very well was, instead of developing a software application from scratch, they integrated with Salesforce to the point where that integration is so strong that you don't know where Salesforce starts and Aptus ends. And the reason that works so well for them is because now, for their own users, the platform is already so familiar. You don't feel that you have to learn so many things that are new all at once. And I think that a mistake that a lot of business presenters make, and business communicators in general, is that they don't hook too much or too often into people's existing habits. Because once you go there, that means you appeal to an existing schema, a script that they already have formed, and that means their brains don't have to think that much. That means they will be with you longer. That means attention is more of a given.
That's awesome. That's a great example of like really designing software, designing a website in a way that's really more familiar for people to navigate. But what about, if you're doing like a PowerPoint presentation or a keynote speech, how could you add familiarity to that?
For PowerPoint presentations, I'm glad that you're bringing up that mental framework. Because see, even you mentioning that, suddenly we have a strong picture that is similar for you and I, because everybody has a mental schema for what.
Right, the total familiarity with everyone knows what a PowerPoint presentation is.
Yes. And I'm always intrigued when I hear advice to presenters that says, remove all the bullet points, remove all the complex charts and diagrams. People love pictures. And that's not always the case, because if your audience expects a list of bullet points, if your audience expects complex charts, and that's what they consider familiar, if you're jarring them too much, it's going to not work in your favor. Take, for instance, highly technical presentations. I'm always amazed when engineers, for instance, receive the advice of, oh, you have to add more pictures. No, you don't. If your audiences expect something that is super technical and fairly complex, simply showing a picture of somebody fishing by a lake is not going to get people to remember a lot more. On the contrary, they may remember how jarred they were and the negative emotion, and that's definitely not in your favor. The problem is that people abuse complexity. So let's just say that if you had that PowerPoint deck of 20 slides, every single thing now has a list of bullet points and something that is complex. So after a while, the brain gives up just because it has to think too much. So the recommendation that I would have is to make sure that you don't simplify complexity, but you manage complexity better. In the sense of less is not more for memory, by the way. If you talk to memory experts, you and I were just having a brief discussion before this interview, you will realize that when we improve our own memory and we take it seriously, we go through a fairly complex set of exercises like visualization and adding some narratives into something that would otherwise be boring. So you need a lot more stimulation, not less of it, in order to create a memory trace. So I wouldn't say simplify your complexity. I would say manage it better, in the sense of you can give the brain something complex, if that's what it expects, and then you can ease down the stimulus. And then you can take it again to something that's familiar and complex, and then you can ease it off.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So can you give us like a practical example of what do you mean by, like, giving something really complex and easing off?
So for example, if we're talking about that idea of somebody fishing by a lake, I wouldn't start with a picture to an audience that is composed of engineers and somebody who expects something that is fairly technical. I would start with the complexity that is a pattern they expect. And only after a few minutes, I may break that pattern with something they don't expect, such as a picture of someone fishing by a lake, and there is perhaps a metaphor that links the two. Otherwise, what people are being taught these days is to go exactly the opposite direction. Start with a picture, start with a story. And while stories are very critical for memory, if people don't expect a story, it's a turnoff. And therefore, you have lack of attention, and therefore you have lack of memory.
Gotcha. That's really good advice.
You have to earn the right to tell a story.
That makes sense, right? Because yeah, I mean, especially for engineers, I can imagine, if I just went into a room of engineers and just started talking, 10 minutes of just storytelling, they'd probably be like completely checked out.
Exactly. And I was just talking to an audience of technical people, and somebody was saying, if I didn't put all the complexity and all of the intricate things that I've been working on in there, my boss would think that I'm lazy. So you see, you have to appeal to people's expectations, because if you're jarring them too much out of those, that means their brains now have to expand too much cognitive power. And after a while, it just simply gives up and looks elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So you definitely makes sense that you want to appeal to people's expectations and kind of give them what they expect. But then is that novelty, like, is that an important memory principle? Is novelty really important
Definitely
as well?
So, because the drawback of giving people too much of what they expect, after a while, the brain habituates. And it's unfortunate that the brain habituates very, very quickly. Like right now, as you think for your own examples, tell me some things that were new to you at first, but then after a while, they became kind of like a mundane norm.
I mean, cooking,
Yeah, there you go.
learn a recipe and it's amazing. And then like the 10th time you make it, it's like, well, this is the same thing again.
Yes. So you may be cooking like this delicious recipe, and all the tastes and the smells and the touch are just so new at first, and they capture all of your senses and all of your attention is right on there. I remember, and even in the book, I included this example. There was a creative director at Hallmark, and he's describing his skydiving lessons. And imagine, this is skydiving, like you cannot afford to not pay attention and not be involved. And he takes the first lesson and he's just exhilarated. And then he takes his second one and his third one. By the seventh one, as he's flying and he's just going at an extremely fast speed, and he can see the ground underneath his feet just coming closer and closer, and there is this abundant air fluffing through his clothes, and he's thinking, I wonder what's for dinner. And imagine this, if you have time now to think about some other extraneous things as you're skydiving, you know your brain has habituated to what's happening. And our audience's brains are no different. So feed their expectations at first, so that you create something that is familiar, and that also induces, by the way, a positive feeling. So you have a good emotion, and the brain doesn't feel threatened in any way. And then disrupt the pattern that the brain has learned to expect. So if we're talking about technical content, so you have complex, and suddenly you can hit them with something that is more simple, or something that where the emotion is more intense. That's where we have to ask the question, what is a pattern that my audience's brains have formed so far? And then go in a different direction. So to tell me some of your example, for instance, what is a pattern that has been disrupted for you lately that just made you pay attention in a stronger way?
I don't know. I'm actually not really sure.
So as you continue thinking about that, I'm trying to think that what that is for me. Think fitness, or think sports, for example. It used to be that you would just show up at the gym, and maybe there are some group classes, and all that fitness activity takes place on the ground. Now these days, you can go to some of these fitness classes and things take up in the air. That you may have heard of aerial yoga, for example.
Yep.
And there is a pattern that that has been disrupted when it comes to fitness. I'm sure that you can find many examples where communication is concerned, or travel, or just brushing your teeth. Just go from the journey of the manual toothbrush to the electric one. At some point, the brain habituates, and you have to disrupt its patterns if you want to jolt it into some extra attention.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So one great example I got, for our publishing industry is, when I go on planes now, when I travel, and you're walking through the aisle to find your seat, like everyone's reading, right? But there's I've never seen more than 2 or 3 paperback books on a plane in the last couple of years. But you'll see tons of Kindles and iPhones and iPads, people reading on those. So I've definitely noticed that switch has been pretty dramatic compared to the last 10 years of travel.
Exactly. That's why people even use this word disruption. What is disruption but an interruption of a pattern that the brain has habituated to? So for anybody listening, as they investigate their own content, the practical guideline is this: allow the brain to form a pattern first and then disrupt it. Because the mistake that I'm noticing, especially where business content is concerned, is that now we're going the opposite direction. So for instance, PowerPoint presentations. Let's just say that we have lots of text-oriented slides, or lots of complexity that goes on. And we want to go the opposite direction with pictures and things that are so varied. And when everything is so varied, then nothing really has a chance to stand out. And if everything was simple in your presentation, it would get so boring after a while, because it's, again, pattern that's not disrupted. But if everything was complex, then it just gets too difficult after a while. So that's why it's this rhythm of going in and out of a pattern that your audience expects that keeps them paying attention. You see, attracting someone's attention is, after all, not that difficult. Keeping their attention for a sustained amount of time, that's where the skill is, and that's where you go pattern disruption.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So, what about the presentation length? I mean, is there a way scientifically to capture someone's attention and hold their attention for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours? I've heard about studies people check out after 10 minutes and so on. Is that really true?
Those are very difficult to monitor, especially in business circumstances. But what is true is this: we know that the brain is capable for sustained attention periods. We wouldn't be watching Avatar for 3 hours if that wasn't the case. Or a more recent one, The Martian. Have you seen The Martian?
Yeah, great movie.
That is a great movie, and that is a darn long movie also. But I bet you that when you watched The Martian, you didn't get up and make a sandwich. And so we know that the brain is capable of sustained periods of attention. And when people say, oh, we only sustain attention for minutes at a time, or Some other claims are that these days our attention span is a lot shorter. Those are not so substantiated when it comes to neuroscience. What we know is this. We know that the brain habituates very quickly to a stimulus that does not change. And there are two reasons for habituation if we were to explain them from a science angle. And those are internal stimulus variation, and that's just a fancy way of saying how often does something vary within that stimulus. And the second one is the degree of arousal. And that one is more subjective. So for instance, if I were to take your blood pressure right now and study your heart rate, I could tell how quickly you get so excited at a stimulus or how quickly you get bored. And depending on some of your personality traits, you might get excited at a leaf falling, or I'm sure that you know people who you can show them the Martian, you can show them the greatest electronic devices on the planet, and they go like, whatever. So, but those are more subjective traits, and as a communicator, it's a lot harder to control those. But what you can control is the first aspect, which is how often do you vary the stimulus. So for example, it's a lot harder to habituate to the sounds and the images that are coming from a TV set, such as a movie, such as The Martian, versus habituating to a running fan. And that's because in the former one, the stimulus varies, and in the latter one, it does not. So to answer the question, how long should a communication segment be in order to sustain attention, is to ask another question, which is, how often do you have the courage to vary the stimulus? And I say have the courage because sometimes in business, we get so attached to some of our content and present it in exactly the same way. So like people would use a PowerPoint presentation, for instance, and leave a slide up there for minutes at a time. And because the stimulus doesn't change, that's why the audience's brains are more focused towards something else that does change, such as looking at your phone, checking out emails, which constantly are changing. So looking for some change in your environment. So it's not so much that our attention span has gotten shorter. What has changed in the past few decades is that our threshold for stimulation has changed. Are you noticing the same thing? Like the brain constantly wants to be entertained. It constantly wants to grasp onto something that is constantly changing and moving.
So what you're saying is nowadays, like we need more stimulation change in our presentations because our audience is used to that, like used to watching TV and used to smartphones and iPads and that kind of thing.
Exactly. So if you were to do a study, for instance, and look at the average shot length for movies, since you're talking about movies, in the 30s and 40s, it used to be about 10 seconds. If you're looking at the average shot length for like a Born Supremacy, I'm sure you've seen those movies. The average shot length for Born Supremacy is 2.4 seconds. Imagine that. And it's not so much that the length has gotten shorter for some of these shots. There's also more motion in some of these shots. And not only do you have very succinct segments, but you also have so much motion to the point where things are almost chaotic, like you have no idea what in the world is going on. So that combination of something short and also happening at a brisk pace with a lot of motion, that's what seems to keep audiences glued to the screen. Obviously, not every single shot in the Born Supremacy is done that way with that kind of intensity. But what I'm cautioning all of our listeners and our viewers to do is to investigate their own content and wonder this: how often do I provide a cut? If we were to borrow from a Hollywood term.
Gotcha. That's a great point. Yeah, I mean, I've definitely noticed that in movies, like say an action movie, right? Where you just action scenes and you're like, oh, that action scene was amazing. And then it goes and there's like some sappy love scene and it's like slow and I'm like, get back to the action, right? But I can see how that can definitely keep the viewer engaged because it's not just the same thing over and over.
Exactly. And speed is only one thing that you can vary. There are many others. So moving from something that is formal to something that is informal in business, moving from something that is a monologue to something that is a dialogue, moving from something that is more factual based to something that is more sensory based and describes things in more perceptive elements, something that is fairly straightforward to something that is more emotional. So you have a lot of these switchbacks, and the stimulus, it's up to you. The stimulus doesn't really even matter that much, but what does is the change between the type that you offer.
Gotcha. So can you give us some examples of clients that you've worked with and how you've kind of changed their presentations to make them more memorable?
Yeah, there was a client that we were working with just recently, and he's the CEO of a company called Marketo. And Marketo does marketing automation. I'm sure that you're very familiar with the space. And not too long ago, he had to deliver a speech for 90 minutes, so that's 90. And his challenge was not necessarily the length or the size of the audience. We were about 4,500 people in his room. His challenge was that he had to sustain this audience's attention for all that time, knowing that Hillary Clinton was going to speak after him. So that's not the easiest task. But we apply this principle that I'm sharing in the sense of varying the stimulus often. So for the 90 minutes, it wasn't just him talking on the stage. It was him expressing a message, after which we would switch to some of his customers that are using Marketo in their own business, and you have 3 or 4 of those coming on the stage. So there is a stimulus change between the speakers. Then you'd move from the brain habituating to seeing slides up there on the projection screens to the audience seeing some demos of a new product that they were releasing. And then you would see some changes between something that is fairly factual about Marketo customers or accomplishments that they had to something that is a little bit stronger in terms of narratives and storytelling. So all of these in and out between the different stimulus types where he was able to use in order to sustain an audience's attention for 90 minutes while they're all anticipating somebody else's presentation.
Gotcha. Yeah. So just as you're describing this, all these different, the slides changing, different speakers, the demos, it almost sounds to me like you're planning a movie, right? It literally is, because it's like there's so much different things going on. It's almost like instead of a presentation, it's more like a show.
Exactly right. So from presentations to performances is what we would have to do if you want to aspire at longer attention bursts. But not to say that small segments are not good. But if you want to stay, the longer you want the brain to stay with you, the more of this internal variation you have to provide.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's really interesting. That's fascinating. I've never really thought about it that way, like changing like a presentation into like, what do you call it? How did you say that again? That sounded really cool.
It's called a stimulus internal variation, meaning that as you have a stimulus type, let's just say pictures, and the more something varies within that stimulus, the longer the attention span, simply because the brain has been designed not to miss anything. For those ancestors of ours who missed stuff, they're no longer our ancestors. And that's why you can count more. It's not impossible for the brain to still look away, but you can count more on the brain staying with you if it does not predict what happens next.
Gotcha. That's awesome. Yeah, and I love that quote you said, from presentation to performance, like changing that perspective. And that to me just, that's going to be big. I'm actually going to go over my presentations and see how I can, tweak them and make them improve them.
That's all it's all about. Remember the question, how often do you provide a cut? That's how you can tell.
Totally. Great. So then let's make a cut now. Let's switch and talk about, your personal life and like how you came across this information and why you do the work that you do.
The work that I do, which is cognitive science, I specialize on neuroscience, which neuroscience is the field that studies the structure and function of the brain. And I'm drawn to it just because it's so good when we have clarity about things that we do and some of the reasons that we do them in our personal lives or professional lives. And that clarity is so needed, because I'm sure you've noticed this trend lately where everything has now neuro in front of it. And you have neuro marketing, you have neuro drinks, you have neuro anything. I'm waiting for somebody to come up with like neuro knitting. And it's
neuro supplements, all kinds of stuff.
Yes. So as scientists, we have to step back and wonder, okay, what differentiates some claims from other claims? And what we benefit more from is knowing the distinction between a theory that you have or some observation that you make versus some cognitive or behavioral studies versus pure neuroscience. And the distinction is this. Let's just say that I made an observation that caffeine is going to give you an extra physical burst and a cognitive boost. And I just watch you drink some caffeine and then watch you run a mile, or watch you complete some puzzles. And I'm thinking, I think that Tom is doing a lot better with caffeine or without. So that's just simply a theory or an observation that I make. But then I can maybe put you to the test. So I can say, okay, now let's actually calculate. If I give you caffeine, how fast do you run the mile? If you have no caffeine, how fast do you run? Or if I give you caffeine, how quickly can you complete a puzzle? So now we're adding a bit of data into this, and it's either cognitive or behavioral. So that's a second set of data you can comment on. And then the third one is I give you the caffeine, and then I actually put you in an fMRI machine, and now I'm giving you some puzzles to complete, or some riddles of sorts, or some passages to read, those sorts of things. So now I can actually see what happens in the brain at a molecular level. So we have to learn this distinction, because otherwise we won't really know what's happening when people make these claims of neuro anything. Because now that you know this distinction, observe next when people claim to use brain science or neuroscience into things, and then wonder what angle are they using. Because I guarantee a lot of people claim neuroscience, but they don't really report on things that are the results of fMRI studies or EEG studies, PET scans, those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So what can we learn from these brain scans? Like how can it actually help us understand how the brain works and how to better communicate with other people?
The brain scans are interesting to notice and observe, simply because now you have penetrated into the human skull, and you have a lot more information about what goes on in there. Imagine this: before all of these advanced brain imaging technologies, we would look at the head and then the brain almost like a factory that you couldn't really enter. You would know that there's this factory, and you put in some wood on one side, and on the other side you have like chairs and tables that are coming in, and you're kind of concluding that whatever's going on in there is producing all of this furniture. Now we've been able to peek underneath there and see. We have been able to enter the factory. So that's the great news. And we've discovered so many more brain regions in terms of what they do and how they function than we have in the whole human history combined. So we used to know only a few regions in the brain. Now we know more than 200. Do we know everything? Definitely not. So that's a caution for everybody too, by the way. Even though we have all of these great findings, it's not like we can assume and generalize that they always work, because we are just in the beginning. Neuroscience is still an adolescent. So with that, we have to be cautious about. Also, fMRI studies, for example, they're so expensive to carry. So whoever is looking in academic journals and want to extract some guidelines that we can use in any field, please pay attention to, for instance, the amount of participants who are being included in some of these studies. Because for most of them, you will see, as a result of this fMRI study that included all of 10 participants, or 12, 20 usually is a good number if you can even afford to do that. So just know that they're very expensive, and the population is very small. Therefore, the ability that we have to generalize is greatly reduced. But that aside, however, there are some great advancements that we're making, and it would be a shame not to start using and playing with some of these findings in practice, because otherwise, why would we even go through these expenses? So a study, for instance, that has impacted me greatly is that these days, in an fMRI study, for instance, if I show you some pictures, let's just say that I would choose a set of indoor-outdoor photos. Based on how those photos are created and where you tend to be looking, I can observe on a scanner the birth of a memory. So I'm more likely to predict which pictures you're likely to remember and which ones you're likely to forget. And to me, that's huge. If we made it to the point where we can predict something that is memorable versus forgettable, and then we can start playing with, like, for instance, what made a difference in this study is the physical intensity of the stimuli. So if you see like an extremely red sunset, because that stimulus is so intense compared to other pieces that are weaker, then you're more likely to obviously pay attention, and as a result, form a memory trace. So physical aspects of any stimuli that you're creating are very, very important in how you attract people's attention and therefore make them remember.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, I'm just thinking, like, looking in the future, like nowadays, the marketers, you'll do like split tests, like with Facebook ads or Google ads, and maybe you'll have different images and different headlines to see, which ones, make more people click, which ones convert better, which is kind of in its own way like a, kind of studying people's brains of what they react to, right? But I'm just thinking now, like in the future, like if this technology gets cheaper, like what if companies just start hiring, scientists to start doing brain scans of their customers to see which of their branding and logos and images and headlines create those memories better. Do you think that's kind of the future of neuroscience, at least when it comes to business?
Why not? It's possible. It's what if in the future we're going to have this brain imaging techniques and capabilities in our smartphones. So you could just be putting it right around your brain, and there it goes. There's your scan. Or you might be just going through a booth, very much like you go to the airport, and maybe some things will be revealed there. Anything is possible, and technology luckily advances exponentially. And imagine if we've made these many advances in just the past few decades, what's possible in the next few. But here's a question for all of us. I'm curious what you think about this. If we could observe the birth of a memory, and in the future, maybe we can combine our organic structure with some nanobots, let's just say, there might be a time where you can actually download your memories onto Facebook. Would you download your memories onto social media?
Yeah, I've actually had a conversation like this before with other people, and then talking about like, basically you could like download your brain to like a computer, and you could like have eternal life because your brain would be on a computer somewhere. And to me, it just sounds a little bit crazy and far-fetched. And I'm sure, I don't know. I mean, I would hate to underestimate what humans can do, because we, have the ability to create unbelievable and amazing things. But for me, I don't know. It doesn't sound too appealing personally, but I'm open to learning more.
It's an interesting angle to be looking at memories, and if we were to define them as the database of self, the minute that you have the ability to share them and share them in a more accurate view versus a changed view, because right now our memories are not an accurate replica of reality. And each time that we recollect something, by the way, we have the ability to change it right then and there. So it would be interesting to realize how much of our self do we want to share with others, and if we're prepared for that state. Because essentially you're sharing your own database with somebody else.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's the potentials are kind of limitless with what humans can do, and with evolution technology.
Yes.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Carmen, you shared just some amazing information with us today, and I really appreciate it. And before you go, I'd love to hear more about the work that you're doing and where people can connect with you.
So our company is called Rexy Media, and Rexy comes from the Latin verb to direct or to guide. So our philosophy is that to the extent that you are able to guide your own audience's attention to what counts, and you make the important messages stick, and you enable people to make decisions easier, then you can aspire at behavioral change. And ultimately, why create any kind of communication if you're not incurring some behavior change? And the only reason, by the way, people are even intrigued by studying more about memory is that memory is at the roots of all decision making. So that's the only reason why we're intrigued by it in the first place. So rexymedia.com is our website, and my Twitter information is at Are You Memorable? And I'm hoping that as people are using some of these insights, their answer will be yes.
Awesome. And just remind everyone that her book is Impossible to Ignore, Creating Memorable Content to Influence Decisions. And I'm actually going to pick it up on Amazon right now and read it, because it's definitely something I want to learn more about to help me just become a better communicator. So thanks so much, Carmen. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. And I look forward to the feedback once you read the book.
Absolutely. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.